Hello and welcome back to the Pondering Papaya podcast for an emergency episode of the show after McLaren announced some huge news regarding their technical team. David Sanchez, a man who only officially joined 3 months ago, has walked out the door after what he described as the role we envisioned and agreed to not being aligned with the reality of the one he found. Joining me a little late in the show to discuss this huge news will be Adam Burns of the DNF1 podcast, but first let me run you through exactly what's gone down at the MTC. Now, before we get to the news, it's worth giving you a little reminder of who David Sanchez is. As he's a French engineer, it will not come as much of a shock that he started his F1 career at Renault, but he did so at a good time as he became part of the team that allowed Fernando Alonso to win the World Championship. He was also a name familiar to McLaren, having joined the Woking side in 2007. In 2012, Ferrari came calling, and by the time he left to return to McLaren, he was chief engineer of vehicle concept. So to bring you up to date with what's happened, cast your mind back to March last year, and after an awful start to the year, McLaren opted to fire technical chief James Key, and in his place, create 3 new roles. One of these roles went to Sanchez, who was given the title of Technical Director of Car Concept and Performance, but as he was working with Ferrari at the time, he had to wait until the start of 2024 before officially joining McLaren, making his sudden departure all the more surprising. McLaren described the change as part of their relentless quest to establish the higher technical standards, but it's not just Sanchez whose future's changed. Rob Marshall, another man who joined at the same time as Sanchez, having left Red Bull, will now become chief designer, while Neil Holdy is the new technical director of engineering. Peter Pedromadou will continue in his role as technical director of aerodynamics, but interestingly, McLaren say the concept and performance department, which used to be Sanchez's former role, will now be headed up by Andrea Stella in an interim role before they find a new appointment. As for Stella, here's what he had to say on the news. He said, "This further step in the evolution of the structure of the technical department and of the working model within the team signify our commitment to constantly enhancing our technical capabilities and workflows for greater efficiency and effectiveness." Following thoughtful discussions between David Sanchez and the team leadership, the mutual decision has been taken for David to leave the team. Upon our joint reflection, it's become apparent that the role, responsibilities, and ambitions associated with David's position did not align with our original expectations when he agreed to join us in February 2023. Recognizing this misalignment, both David and I agreed that it would be best to part ways now, so to enable him to pursue other opportunities that will better leverage the full scale and breadth of his remarkable skill set. We greatly and gratefully value the contributions that David has made during his relatively short time with us, and we wish him the best in his future endeavours. David Sanchez, meanwhile, said, "I am grateful for the opportunity to have been a part of the team. While the role we envisioned and had agreed to was not aligned with the reality of the position I found, I leave with respect for the leadership, admiration for the dedication of my colleague, and appreciation for the openness and honesty in which we discussed and arrived at this decision. I wish this team continued success as it continues its journey to the front of the grid where it belongs. I look forward to my next challenge within F1. Now, as promised, after a short break, I'll be back with Adam Burns of the DNF1 podcast to give you our opinions on this big news. So joining me now, as promised, is Adam. And Adam, I guess my first question for you is, have you ever had a job where you were employed for just 3 months? Have you ever worked that small a job?
There was one, but it was kind of like I was transferred when I was working years ago when I was working for a supermarket back in my college days, and I'd gotten a job over Christmas, and that was all fine and well. It looked like it was going to be made like a permanent thing, but then I ended up getting transferred to a different branch altogether, literally a month later. So it kind of isn't leaving one job for another, but I can kind of relate a little bit.
That sounds very Red Bull of your supermarkets, like swapping their employees between different teams, like making sure you're in the right spot. So yeah, I like that. That's a good example. The only one I can ever think of is for one summer I worked at like a milkshake shop, but the problem is the customer would come in and they'd ask for something like a tropical sunset. I'm there like a 16-year-old, have no idea what that was, so I just throw anything in and just give it back, saying "Go away, go away." Anyway, hopefully this is now more in our wheelhouses, more in our what we know and we can talk about. So yeah, I've already sort of given the rundown of what's happened, but I just wanted to get some kind of reaction from it because I don't know about you, but this was a complete shock for me. Obviously, I mentioned earlier in the podcast that he's been there for 3 months. Like he's waited even longer to get into the job. Like, what were your initial thoughts when you saw the news that David Sanchez is departing?
Very surprised. At the time last year, when we first heard the news that David Sanchez was going to be leaving to Ferrari to go to McLaren, this was seen as a major coup for McLaren with this ongoing restructure that was led by, obviously, by Andrea Stella and Zach Brown and everyone else at McLaren. And David Sanchez was a huge focal point of that with Rob Marshall, of course, when he came from Red Bull. So to hear that only after 3 months that he is now moving on, despite obviously being very amicable between both parties, it is a real surprise. And of course, it does raise questions if there are any issues with the new technical structure at McLaren, or if, simply put, David just wasn't the right fit after all for what McLaren were going for.
Yeah, I want to drill down on that amicable bit you said because I think you're right, but there were some choice words maybe used in the press release. I sort of just want to highlight. Right at the start, they're talking about having a relentless quest to establish the highest technical standards, which sort of implies that David Sanchez isn't the highest technical standard. I don't know if I'm reading too much into that. And then we go into
I read it like
Andres.
that as well, to be fair.
Okay, good. Yeah,
That's
that did
exactly
seem
how I read it, first of all.
it did
So,
seem
yeah.
straight away with a dig quite early on, but we're going to what Andrea Stella said as well. He said constantly enhancing our technical capabilities, and he was saying Sanchez didn't align with our original expectations, and it wasn't just the McLaren side of things either. Like I think David Sanchez's line that the role we envisaged and had agreed to was not aligned with the reality of the position I found. Like that's really quite telling, isn't it? Like it's not like he's an entirely new role. Like it was quite obvious what he was in charge of, and for him to say that I don't know, somewhere along the line, either words got crossed or maybe a promise didn't materialize. Like that's quite telling, isn't it, of sort of what was going on behind the scenes?
I think there's two schools of thought with this. You can either think of it in that manner, or you can think of it that perhaps David himself was expecting more of McLaren, and it wasn't living up to what he was hoping for in the first few months. But given the nature of this departure and how quick it's been, and also you've got Rob Marshall in there as well, and both of them would have had their eyes wide open as to what McLaren were going to be capable of and what they were hoping to achieve. I think it's more what we've been talking about already. I think over the first few months, for whatever reason, David perhaps has not lived up to the expectations Andrea Stella and Zach Brown had for him, and perhaps the role required. And that's why they've acted quite swiftly. I think, again, I think that's how I'm reading it. And based on the other personnel that are there, and the likes of Rob Marshall taking this new role on as the chief designer, if David wasn't happy with how things were going there, Rob certainly wouldn't have been happy of how things were going. So the fact that he's staying is probably the most telling part of all of this.
Yeah, it does seem quite bizarre, really. Like, I mean, I mentioned it a bit earlier, but the way that contracts work in F1 is like if you leave a job, you're essentially committing to being on the sidelines for a long time. Like this move to McLaren was announced in March last year, and he had to wait all the way till 2024 before moving officially into McLaren and starting work there. And now he's pretty much committed to doing it again. Yes, there may be some kind of deal with McLaren. They let him go to a team. That seems unlikely. It seems like he's going to have to wait another year if he does want to move to any kind of different team on the grid, regardless who that is. Like, I mean, if you mention that he's been maybe not lived up to expectations, is that a little bit harsh? Because like, just not from your opinion, I must say, but from McLaren, because just the way building an F1 car works, obviously, by the time both he and Rob Marshall arrived, this car that we're seeing on track, both in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, whatever, that would have been designed months ago. They would have had very little impact in it. They would have almost done no design work on it. They may have given a few little pointers, very small things, but in reality, like the majority of their work hasn't happened yet. So, do you think it's incredibly harsh of McLaren to judge a guy on his work when we haven't really seen his work like coming up at all?
Well, I mean, it depends on how people interpret this gardening leave period. I don't know why I enunciated that with the fingers as you do, because this is an audio only pod. But it's for your benefit, Sam, of course.
I really enjoyed it.
Um,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you. So yeah, I suppose it depends on how you interpret the gardening leave, because it's not as simple as we both know. It's not as simple as you sit and tend to your garden or whatever it is you want to do for a year and then you join the team. There's obviously going to be communications going on between McLaren and between David Sanchez throughout that period when he'd left Ferrari, of what McLaren were hoping to achieve, what design ideas he may have had, or what information he would have liked to have passed on to them within reason that he could do. Obviously, Ferrari would have tried to mitigate as much as that as possible. But so it's not just the 3 months. So get into that period where they are now, where obviously things weren't working out, and you know, I don't necessarily think it's as simple as saying, "Oh, David Sanchez has not lived up to expectations, and therefore he's not good enough." But at the same time, I think you also have to look at Ferrari's situation and where they were in 2022, when obviously they had their new car come out. Things started really, really well with the concept. And then obviously it started to falter because the concept was limited. And Red Bull obviously went on an absolute tear. McLaren have gone through a resurgence in the last 12 to 18 months in that period of time. Whilst at the same time, you can argue the same for Ferrari, for the better. And because of that, and because of the fact that Sanchez wasn't a part of that, and he was a part of the era that came before it, the pre-Vasseur era, if you like, McLaren may have felt a little bit that perhaps that, you know, Sanchez leaving Ferrari was a good thing for them. And McLaren may feel that perhaps what he has had to offer them has not lived up to what they hoped that they were going to be getting. So they've decided to pull the trigger on this, agree an amicable departure between both parties. And hopefully for both sides, it's for the better. But as you said already, I think it does tell that perhaps this is a knock on David Sanchez's record, even though I think that is a little harsh, but obviously time will tell.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm sure, like we've seen with a lot of F1 staff that have left recently, they soon get snapped back up. I'm thinking of Pat Fry, obviously moved to Williams and stuff like that. I doubt it'll be that long before we see him back in the sport at least. Speaking of McLaren, like obviously there's even more of a shift now. Like I mentioned last year, we had this big, pretty much like a revolutionary way of doing things. Like they took their technical team, they split into three chunks, and now we've seen that Alpine have done something similar. Granted, to a lesser degree, it's Alpine at the moment, but they obviously that blueprint's been followed. One person I want to sort of talk about and get your view on it, like, is Andrea Stella, because I don't know about you, but I thought it was very noticeable that there was no quotes from Zach Brown in this press release, and very much Zach Brown's often the first voice you hear from. I'm thinking back to when Lando signed his deal earlier this year. I'm pretty sure the first words on the McLaren press release were from Zach Brown. Like he tends to be the guy that's leading the team, that's been the vocal face of the team, the face of the team, and the vocal voice behind it. But in this one, he's absent. I was like, it really makes it seem like it was a decision that came from Andrea Stella. And of course, now Andrea Stella's got even more to do because he's essentially taken on the role of David Sanchez whilst also being team principal. What do you make of Stella? Like, I mean, we've had sort of a year now of him being in this role. Like, he's obviously done quite a good job. The team have really improved. But would you agree with me that this really seems like it was him clashing with David Sanchez, and that's sort of where this result has come from?
Quite possibly. I mean, I, I mean, my Ferrari history is, I think it stacks up relatively well, but I can't really say with confidence if Andrea Stella and David Sanchez had history at Ferrari when they were both working there. Obviously, a Ferrari expert that probably isn't listening to this pod, because this is a McLaren pod, will probably have to tell me somewhere else if that was the case. But um, to be honest, I think when you look at Andrea Stella, you have to look at the 12 months that he's been at McLaren and well, he's obviously been there longer than that, but the impact that he has had since he's been in this big role running the show now, or on the engineering side, I suppose, or in regards to the car, not necessarily the business element, which Dak Brown has obviously done a great job on. And I think you have to put that trust in him that he has earned, in admitting quite openly last season that McLaren were in a difficult place and a lot of work was going to be needed to done to bring it back to where they feel it should be. And credit to him, he has orchestrated a huge resurgence in McLaren. Now, of course, let's not get carried away because they're not winning races and fighting for world championships yet, but they are taking that step in the right direction. So, when you look at Andrea Stella and what he's having to take on and what he's now inserting himself into, I think if you're a McLaren fan, as difficult as it may be with a decision like as big as this one happening so quickly into this process, I think you kind of just have to wait and see how things play out and trust Andrea Stella that he is making that right decision and that they will continue to make progress with or without David Sanchez. And obviously now we'll find out how that will go.
Hmm. And in just terms of the future, obviously we're a few days out from Suzuka. I mean, it's unlikely, isn't it, to have any real impact on this weekend?
I don't think it's going to have a major impact on McLaren's performance for some time. As I said, there was a lot of works going on with the new parts. Obviously, they were a bit delayed from where they would have liked them. But, when they're ready, and as we've seen from McLaren last season, when they're ready, they should help McLaren push further forward. And let's be honest, Sam, even though McLaren were reportedly behind on where they would have liked to have been, they're still the third fastest car on the grid. They've only got Red Bull and Ferrari to really catch up to. And those two, obviously, especially Red Bull, but Ferrari has shown that obviously when things are working right, how big a jump that you can make. So I don't think this will bother McLaren too much at all. It's a bit disappointing, but when we look back on this in 6-9 months' time, we'll know if that was the right decision or not. We may not even know until next year when next year's car breaks cover. So yeah, I wouldn't worry if I was a McLaren fan right now. I think this sort of stuff happens all the time. It's just big news because of the short stint that David was in that role for. And obviously, Andrea's quickly moved in to try and, mitigate any lost time or performance that may come from it.
Hmm. That's a very wise point. I think that's a good place to end it. Thanks again for you. I appreciate a very short notice. I mean, we had to quickly jump on a call. This news came out of complete nowhere, as I mentioned. But yeah, thanks again for joining. And you can listen to the excellent DNF1 podcast and all your favorite podcast services. I mean, maybe he'll move back to Ferrari. Maybe we'll see him return there one day. But yeah, thanks again, Adam, for joining.
Well, based on what we've seen right now, I'm not sure if I'd be happy with that. But, David is an excellent technical director, and I'm sure he will offer great services to wherever he goes next. I mean, it's like James Key going to Sauber, and he's doing all right there. So I'm sure David will land on his feet and do fine wherever he goes.
Yeah, maybe they'll have a little McLaren reunion because obviously you've got Andreas Seidel at Sauber as well. So maybe it become McLaren V2 in Switzerland. But we shall see. But anyway, we're going to be back on Thursday for our preview of the Suzuka race. But in the meantime, thanks for listening to this bonus episode. And subscribe on all the usual places. Follow us on @Pondering Papaya. And yeah, thanks for listening.